The audio production of Chapter 1 of the Primeval Part 2 was written by John Opalenik and read by John Campagna. The intro and outro music was written and performed by Ghostwoods. Hear more of their music at www.ghostwoods.net. For more of John's writing, go to johnopalenik.com. Raymond and his roommate, Corey, sat in front of their large flat-screen TV that they could barely afford. Cans of beer rested on the beer guts that they'd been working on since they started grad school together. And they watched a grizzly bear beat the ever-loving shit out of Leonardo DiCaprio for what seemed like forever. After a long silence, Raymond grunted, "What a pussy. If that was me, I'd jump on the bear's back and choke him out." "You're so dumb that it physically pains me," Corey replied without taking his eyes off the screen. "You don't think I could do it," Ray accused. "Ray, you've never even been camping. You're not exactly an outdoorsman," Corey explained as he paused the movie and walked into their kitchen to make himself a BLT with vegetarian fake bacon that Ray had nicknamed Christ Bacon, since he said that it tasted like a chewy, bland communion wafer. "Yeah, but I could do it if I had to." Ray poured the remainder of his beer down his throat with one hand and rubbed his belly with the other. "I'd take it down and eat it, and it would be better than that fake bacon you like so much. You've been a vegetarian so long that you don't remember what it's actually supposed to taste like. Dude, I would actually eat a pound of deer meat if you could actually hunt it," Corey laughed doubtfully. "You're on," Ray exclaimed. "What are you talking about? Give me 1 year, and I'll get my hunting license, take down a deer, and you have to eat a pound of it," Ray explained. Corey sat up straighter, suddenly more interested in his roommate's ramblings. "And what happens if you can't do it?" "I'll eat a pound of that nasty, spongy shit you're always eating." "You mean tofu?" "Yeah, I'll eat a pound of tofu if I can't take down a deer within a year." Corey picked up his phone and fired off a quick succession of texts. "I'm texting Aaron, and we're meeting him at the bar so he can be a witness to the bet. I don't want you backing out of the deal." When they arrived at the local dive bar, a hockey game on the television held the interest of everyone in the bar except Aaron, who waited at a round table between two chairs with a pint glass in front of him. They explained their couch-bound argument, which evolved into a bet, and Aaron scrawled the details on the back of a sheet of paper listing the beers that the bar had on tap. Gradually, his pen came grinding to a halt at the bottom of the page. "So, here are the terms. Ray has 1 year to get a hunting license, which Corey will pay for, and shoot a deer." Aaron stood between the two men at the bar and explained the situation that they had already known. If he can do it, Corey's vegetarian ass will have to eat 1 pound of the venison cooked to his preferences. If he fails, then Ray will have to eat 1 pound of tofu cooked to his specifications. It's the 3rd week of March now, so we'll give it until April 1st of next year, just to be generous. Agreed? Ray and Corey shook hands, gripping firmly while maintaining eye contact. During their night of drinking, Corey half hoped that Ray would forget about the bet, simply so he could bring it up at the end of the hunting season when it would be too late for his friend and rival to make good on his bet. The owner of the bar, a Bruins fan, gave them shots of absolutely trash whiskey every time his team scored against the New York Rangers. And Aaron ended up driving them home and one by one walking them up the front steps of the house they rented. First Ray, then Corey. When Corey made it to the 4th step, his legs gave out and Aaron caught him by the hood of his hoodie before hoisting him over his shoulder and dragging him inside, where he promptly dropped him onto the couch, where he lay until he woke up with an absolutely savage hangover. As Corey nursed his hangover, Ray was surprised to feel pretty fine. He tried to get Corey to stop puking long enough to get a cup of coffee at the end of the street, but he told Ray to just go without him. He got a large coffee and felt an urge to go for a run. He slipped on his running shorts and ran a route completely different than the one he'd tried the few times he half-heartedly decided that he'd get in shape. The roads were hillier and didn't make a loop that would lead him back to the duplex he and Corey had been renting the past 6 months. He ran until the lactic acid burned his legs from the inside out and he didn't recognize where he was anymore. When the burning in his legs faded away, the immortality that he'd felt when he woke up, he dropped to his knees, wondering how he could have made it as far as he'd come. His eyes began to well up with tears from the sheer shock of going from feeling absolutely godlike to feeling tragically human in the space of a few seconds. The tears streamed down his cheeks until his beard absorbed them as he raised his head. When he opened his eyes, he saw the forest in front of him as it had been waiting there for him his whole life. He sensed something in front of him and stood up. Ray walked forward through rugged terrain with his eyes fixed on the unseen goal before him. The lactic acid pushed through his muscles like a low and persistent drum, pushing him onward. Finally, an oak tree at the middle of a clearing made him stop in his tracks. The other trees were dwarfed by its sheer mass, and every tree in the forest seemed to be facing towards this one as if they were praying to some primordial god that had been there, waiting namelessly since before the dawn of humanity. He stood in awe of the tree's sheer size at first, and then something undefinable held his gaze. Ray's self-image grew in his mind, taking him from what he'd always been to a force of nature that was as much a part of the wild as it was the most authentic part of him. The part of his mind that regarded humans as something more than animals melted away, and he realized that the only difference between people and other animals was that humans had a choice. They could be predators, or they could be prey. He tongued his canine teeth and felt an affinity with every caveman who ever ate an animal raw, and every warrior down the line of history who killed an enemy with his hands and bathed in the warm baptism of their blood. Ray saw the shadow of a tall but emaciated figure loomed over him before disappearing into the intricate stitchwork of shadow created by the midday sunlight piercing the thick canopy of the forest. Normally it would have terrified him, but he regarded it with curiosity at first, and then with respect and admiration. He stepped towards the shape until the edge of his shadow merged with the jagged shape of a shadowy antler at the top of the gaunt humanoid shape. It took Ray mere weeks to get his hunting license and buy a Marlin lever action 30-30 hunting rifle, which seemed like the best option for someone on a budget. He brought the rifle back to the duplex he shared with Corey and cleared off their kitchen table, so he could clean it and make sure everything was as perfect and precise as he intended it to be when he took it back to the forest. Corey came downstairs with his backpack slung over his shoulder and stopped in his tracks when he saw the rifle on their table. "Dude, are you serious?" "What?" Ray shrugged at his roommate as if he were in the midst of doing something the most normal thing imaginable. "You have a gun on our kitchen table. Is that thing loaded?" Corey shifted to make sure he wasn't standing in front of the rifle's barrel. "Not yet," Ray glared to his roommate. "I have to clean it first." Corey wrung his hands in frustration. "Whatever, dude. Just keep it in the basement. I don't want it to go off by accident and shoot me through a wall or something." Ray put away the cleaning kit that he'd looked up how to use online and watched Corey cross the room and stare at him from the screen door. It was only after a long pause in the doorway that Ray realized that Corey was going to their grad school class and he needed to get a ride from him. He shook his head as if waking up from a daydream and followed Corey out to the car, barely remembering to grab his messenger bag on the way out. Before pulling the car onto the highway, they went by the forest where everything had changed for Ray, and he could feel his heart rapping against the inside of his ribs with increasing intensity as they got closer, and then creeping back to a crawl when the forest wasn't much more than a speck in the rearview mirror. He began doing the mental math to figure out how many days, hours, and minutes it would be until he could spend their night out there. The next 3 days passed with the hazy awareness of dreams. Ray didn't truly feel alive again until Friday, when he started shoveling supplies into his backpack and told Corey that he was camping out in the forest for a hunt, and he'd be back for class Monday. Corey didn't think his friend would go through with it and figured that Ray would come home in the middle of the cold night like a child who missed his parents in the midst of a childhood sleepover. Instead, Ray went missing for over a week. By the second weekend, Corey tried calling Ray and quickly realized that his friend's phone was either turned off or had died. Corey rationalized that it made perfect sense for his phone to die. If he was camping somewhere remote enough to go hunting, there probably wasn't a place to charge his phone. After a few more hours, he decided to find his friend and immediately realized how few precautions Ray had taken to make it easy to find him if something went wrong. He didn't ever tell people where he was going. He always simply referred to it as the forest. Corey racked his brain to think of any details that could narrow down his search. He knew that Ray had gone to the forest on foot at least a few times since they placed their bet, and he knew that while Hopeville, Massachusetts wasn't near any national parks, there were certainly a few large wooded areas that were probably big enough for someone to use for hunting. He wasn't sure what the rules about where someone could go hunting were, but at the same time, he doubted that Ray knew either. Corey took out his laptop and brought up Google Maps and looked up his own address. He zoomed out looking for the pale green that signified large wooded areas, and at first he didn't think that there were any that his roommate could make it to on foot. But then he widened the circle of his search to assume that maybe Ray was in better shape than he'd assumed and found a large patch of green on the map. Corey held up his fingers to the screen as if he were pinching the forest, then dragged his fingers over to the symbol on the map that indicated scale and measured that the forest covered nearly 3 square miles. He didn't think that he could cover that land on his own, but didn't want to call the police, since he figured that his friend had simply pitched a tent in the forest and had been getting drunk for the past week. Instead of calling the police, he phoned their mutual friend, Aaron, who was the only witness of their bet, and the only one who knew Corey figured would understand why Ray had foolishly gotten himself lost in the woods. He picked up Aaron and they drove around the woods near the forest looking for Ray's dark blue Prius and eventually found it parked in the parking lot of a nearby strip mall. Corey looked into the windows of the car and saw Ray's messenger bag from class in the back seat and an empty coffee cup in the cup holder, but not much else. It looked like he hadn't returned to his car during the time he'd been gone. Aaron glanced at the stores in the strip mall and saw signs for a liquor store and a taco shop. I can see why he picked this place. At first, Corey laughed at the quip, but then realized that Aaron made a good point. That's actually a decent idea. I'm going to go in and see if the people there have seen him. Maybe he went in to use the bathroom or buy a taco. They decided to split up. Corey would go into the taco shop and ask if anyone had seen Ray, and Aaron would go into the liquor store and do the same. Aaron made it back first, and 5 minutes later, Corey returned with a grilled vegetable burrito and no answers. Once they realized that there weren't any roads going into the heart of the forest, the two friends walked into the rough and untamed land. As the afternoon turned into evening, they'd wandered north into the forest, in a widening arc, always remembering that they had to go south if they wanted to get back to the cars. Neither of them knew what side of trees moss was supposed to grow on, so they used the setting sun to tell them which direction was west, and they worked their way from there. They worked their way into the dense forest, standing about 50 feet apart, reasoning that they would be able to see one another, but could see more if they walked a little ways apart from each other. Clouds crawled across the sky and dimmed the already dying light and made it hard for Aaron and Corey to see one another. They started using the flashlight functions on their cell phones to light their path and remain visible to one another. They narrowed the distance between each other, partly because of poor visibility in the misty forest, but also because of the tree they both saw overshadowing every other tree in the forest. Just as they reached one another, Aaron's phone died from using the flashlight function. "Shit," Aaron rasped. "We better start heading back. It'll be completely dark soon, and we need to get back to the road while we still have the sun telling us which way is west," Corey thought aloud. "What % battery are you on?" Aaron asked. 50. "Maybe you should turn it off, just in case we need to call someone." Worry crept into Aaron's voice like a stealthy predator sneaking up on its prey. "Good idea." Corey turned his phone off, "though it's not like we could call anyone out here anyway. The reception went to shit as soon as we lost sight of the road." "Maybe that's why you couldn't get a hold of Ray," Aaron reasoned. Corey turned away from the tree and back to the way they had come. "Here, let me go first. If the ground looks sketchy, I can turn my phone back on so we can get a better look at it. The last thing we need is for one of us to twist an ankle out here." They began walking back toward the road, but Aaron stopped silently when he heard a shrill vocalization just past the big tree. He began inching his way back to investigate the sound, while Corey unknowingly kept walking. Aaron had made it all the way back to the monstrous tree by the time Corey realized that his friend wasn't right behind him. Corey turned to his friend and shouted, "Dude, what the hell are you doing?" Aaron rested his hand on the tree and replied, "I think I heard a voice." "No, you didn't." "I'm telling you, I heard it," Aaron insisted. "It sounded really weak. How much of an asshole would you feel like if Ray was hurt and we turned around just a few short feet of finding him?" Corey gestured to the sun, silently noting that their only source of light and the only way they could tell direction in the dense forest was quickly deserting them. "Just wait right here. Give me 5 minutes. I'll be right back." Aaron disappeared from Corey's view, obscured by the mammoth girth of the tree. 5 minutes turned into 10, and Corey began mentally kicking himself for making the same mistakes Ray had made. He didn't tell anyone where they were going, he hadn't brought the right supplies with him, and he had no clue what he was doing. "Aaron, you out there?" Corey called out. When no reply came, Corey quietly inched his way forward to the tree. When he got within 15 feet of it, he heard a rhythmic sound like a zipper being zipped up, but lower and less metallic. The zipping sound repeated 5 times, and then a loud bang like a baseball bat hitting a ball punctuated the sudden sounds, spoiling the silence of the forest. The sudden sound made him freeze in place and listen as if he could pick up some vital detail in the sound that would make everything make sense. But when nothing came, he crept forward as stealthily as he could. At first, he wanted to be heard in the woods so that maybe his friends would hear him. But something about the darkness and that sound made him want to be invisible. Corey pressed his back against the circumference of the gigantic tree and worked his way around to the far side. He froze when he felt something warm and wet against the sensitive skin of his neck. Before his mind could register what he'd felt, a heavy blow struck the back of his head, bringing him to his knees. Corey tried to push himself up from the ground, but the blood seemed to drain from the muscle tissue of his limbs towards his core, and his vision of the already dimly lit forest grew darker and darker until he finally collapsed to the ground. He woke up to an orange glow that he hoped was the sunrise, but the crackling sound he heard told him it was a campfire. The warm glow of the fire slowly brought his surroundings into focus, and Corey's eyes instantly focused on the person squatting in front of him, looking into his eyes. The person was at once familiar and completely alien to him. The face unmistakably belonged to Ray, but his once unruly hair had been shaved down to almost nothing, and there were cuts scattered across his face and the top of his head as if he'd shaved his beard and hair away using a hunting knife, with no shaving cream and no mirror. Corey felt fresh waves of pain keeping time with the increasing pulse he felt in the back of his head. He tried to reach up to press his palm against the pain, but his arms were loosely bound behind his back. Ray waved a hand in front of Corey's face, gauging his awareness. "What are you doing out here?" Corey groaned. "I'm just doing what you told me to. As you can see, I won the bet, and then some." Ray gestured to the campsite he'd made, particularly to the 3 stag heads crudely mounted on trees marking the clearing he'd made between the one gigantic tree and the rest of the forest beyond it. Corey scanned the campsite for any clue to what had happened to Ray to make him act this way. He saw 2 campfires, one large enough to illuminate the camp, and another much smaller one beneath a length of rope that had been fastened to the 2 trees on either side of the fire. Thinly sliced strips of meat that looked like bacon hung over the ropes as if they were a clothesline, allowing the heat and the smoke to dry the meat into jerky. Another tree, illuminated by the fire, had a rope hanging down from a branch leading down to a humanoid figure. As Corey's eyes adjusted to the light, he saw that there was something not quite right about the shape, and when he could finally see, he realized that the shape was Aaron, hanging upside down by his ankle. His limp body slowly turned in the light, revealing that his throat had been cut deeply, and the blood draining from the wound had tapered off into a trickle, slowly dripping the final drops of blood onto a puddle that slowly sank into the dirt and roots that made up the forest floor. His mind told him not to scream, since acknowledging that he saw the body would all but guarantee that Ray wouldn't let him go. The rational side of his mind gave way to the grief over Aaron's death and the terror of his own situation, and he let out a scream that encapsulated horror and loss and hopelessness with a simplicity and authenticity that human language simply couldn't. "Do you feel better now?" Ray squatted and leaned forward close to Corey's face. "Now you're speaking the language, from before humanity. You're speaking the language of gods and monsters. I've taken my place among them. Now I want you to join me." "I can just leave," Corey stammered. "I won't tell anyone what you're doing out here. Just let me go." "I know it may be hard for you. Not everyone is cut out to be a killer," Ray explained as he cut away a strip of flesh from Aaron's arm and hung it over the fire with the rest of the meat. "But everybody eats." Corey's eyes widened with terror at the realization that the meat cooking over the fire wasn't venison, but instead belonged to his friend Aaron. Another howl of horror would have pierced the stillness of the night, but Corey gagged and vomited onto the forest floor in sheer revulsion. Ray took a piece of dried meat off the rope it dangled from, bit into it, and tore a third of it away with an animalistic jerk of his neck. He held out the remainder of it to the still retching Corey, who closed his lips more tightly and tried to look away. Ray bobbed his body back and forth to remain within his friend's line of vision. "We all need to eat, Corey." He racked his brain for any ideas that would lead to him surviving. He thought that he'd had a decent chance of overpowering Ray if he could get free, but with his hands bound behind his back, he couldn't do anything but run. Running seemed like his best option, but he'd need to distract Ray first to get the head start he'd need to make it out of the woods. When Ray offered the piece of meat once more, Corey stood up and tried to stop his body from shaking. Okay, just tell me why." "It has been here since before the first human stood upright. Around the world we've given it different names. The Algonquins called it the Wendigo. The Athabascan people called it Wichuge. It's been called Windwalker and Ithaqua. Eat and pay tribute to it, and it will reward you, making you into more than a man." With that, Corey knew that Ray had completely lost his mind and couldn't be reasoned with, despite the fact that his hands were bound behind his back and Ray probably had a better lay of the land after having spent a week in the forest, he had to try to make a break for it. Corey waited for Ray to lean in and offer him the meat one more time, and he quickly kicked Ray between the legs and began running in a straight line. He didn't know which direction led back to his car, but he reasoned that if he traveled far enough in a straight line, he'd have to make it back to civilization soon enough. Hopeville was a woodsy town, but he doubted that he could go more than a few miles in a straight line without seeing some sign of life that would give him a way out of the nightmare he walked into. Corey ran 50 paces before Ray could recover from being kicked and begin to chase him. He prayed that the head start he'd managed to give himself, along with his 2 years of playing lacrosse in college, would be enough to get out of sight in the darkness. Soon, the glow of the campfire no longer reached him, and while Corey felt more secure knowing that it would be harder for Ray to see him, he also knew that he couldn't see very well in the dark, and a twisted ankle could be a death sentence. He slowed from a sprint to a jog, both to try to move more quietly and to prevent an injury that would make escape an impossibility. When Corey's eyes began to adjust to the darkness, he saw what he thought was a deer standing behind some bushes, and at first he wondered why it didn't run away from him like a deer usually did. Then the creature stood up, and the antlers kept rising higher than any deer or even a moose. Corey didn't know what he was seeing, but he turned away from it and broke into a sprint through the darkness. After only a few steps, the relatively flat land led to a steep hill that Corey couldn't see coming. He tumbled down the steep hill, snapping branches and scraping his skin on the rough, unforgiving terrain. Corey tried to drag himself away, but only managed to make it 10 feet before Ray stood over him. He looked up at Ray and saw the creature that he'd seen before standing behind him, looking on approvingly. "I gave you the chance to pay tribute to the soul of the forest. You could have become so much more than a man, but you'll still honor the Windwalker with a sacrifice of the blood and flesh." We hope you've enjoyed this production of Chapter 1 of the Primeval Part 2, written by John Opalenik, read by John Campagna. Please feel free to share this audio production far and wide. This is a sample of the Primeval Part 2, copyright 2020.